My name is Daniel Cruz, and the last time my family saw me before everything changed, my uncle called me a charity case in front of 47 people. I remember the exact number because I counted. I stood there in the middle of my cousin Brittany's engagement party, holding a paper plate with a piece of shrimp cocktail on it that I hadn't even eaten yet, and my uncle Russ, 6'2", teeth whitened, gold watch catching the light from the chandelier, looked me dead in the eye and said, loud enough for every single person in that room to hear, well, somebody had to invite the cautionary tale. And the room laughed. Not all of them. Not my Aunt Patricia, who looked away fast. Not Brittany herself, who turned pink and pretended to check her phone. But enough of them laughed. Enough of them that the sound bounced off the marble floors of my Aunt Connie's house in Brentwood, Tennessee, and landed somewhere deep in my chest where I've kept it ever since. I was 31 years old. I'd driven 4 hours from Louisville in a car with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that had been on so long I'd stopped seeing it. I was wearing the only blazer I owned, a navy one I'd bought at a Goodwill in 2019, and I'd ironed it twice in the hotel bathroom that morning because I wanted to look right. I wanted to walk in there and just feel like I belonged. Instead, I stood there with my shrimp cocktail while my family laughed. And here's what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of this story. Before I tell you what happened 3 years later on a cold Saturday in December, in that same house, when every single one of those people finally understood who I was, I want you to understand that moment at Brittany's engagement party was not the worst thing my family ever did to me. Not even close. It was just the last thing. And sometimes the last thing is the one that finally sets you free. I grew up in Gallatin, Tennessee, about 30 miles northeast of Nashville. Middle of nowhere if you weren't from there, the entire world if you were. My parents, Gary and Linda Cruz, had me when they were both 23, young and in love and mostly broke, living in a 2-bedroom house on Hartsville Pike with aluminum foil over one window because the blinds had broken and my dad hadn't gotten around to fixing them. My dad worked maintenance at a plastics plant. My mom waitressed at a Cracker Barrel until her feet gave her trouble and she switched to answering phones at a dentist's office. They worked hard. They loved me. They also died within 14 months of each other. My dad from a heart attack when I was 19, my mom from a stroke when I was 20. And just like that, I was an adult with no real safety net, no college degree, and a family that had always seen my parents as the poor branch of the tree. See, my mom's side of the family, the Holloways, they had money. Not old money. Not generational wealth in the way people mean when they say that, but new money, the kind that comes with big opinions and short memories. My grandfather, Virgil Holloway, had built a small chain of tire and auto shops across Middle Tennessee in the 70s and 80s, and when he died, he left the business and most of his assets to his oldest son, my Uncle Russell, Russ, and his second son, my Uncle Gerald. My mom, Patricia, was the youngest, and she'd married Gary Cruz, and in the Holloway family's eyes, that marriage had been a slow exit from polite society. I don't think my grandfather was cruel. I think he just had a way of loving people in ranked order, and my mom ranked below her brothers. She used to laugh about it. She'd say, "Danny, your grandpa thinks love is a pie, and your uncles ate most of it before I got to the table." She said it like it was funny. I think it took her 30 years to admit it hurt. After she died, I had nobody. I mean that with no exaggeration. I had a funeral attended by people who hugged me for 10 seconds each and then went back to their lives, and I had a house my parents had been renting that I couldn't afford to keep, and I had about $4,000 in savings account and a truck with 190,000 miles on it. My Uncle Russ offered to let me stay in his guest house for a month, maybe 6 weeks, while you sort things out. His wife, Connie, smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. My cousin Derek, Russ's son, stood in the doorway of their kitchen eating a sandwich and said, "Don't touch my weights." He was 22. He thought that was funny. I stayed 5 weeks. I sorted things out. And I left. But not before I understood something very clearly about my family. Something I felt in my bones the way you feel weather before it comes. These people had decided who I was a long time ago. I was Gary and Linda's kid. I was the kid who'd grown up with foil on the windows. And no matter what I did, no matter how I showed up or how hard I worked or how carefully I ironed my shirt, they were going to see me through that lens first. Always. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that the lens was about to shatter. Louisville wasn't a plan. It was just where I ended up. I'd heard through a guy I'd worked with at a warehouse in Gallatin that there were jobs in Louisville in logistics and distribution. This was 2013. Amazon was building out its fulfillment infrastructure, and every warehouse within 50 miles of a major city was hiring. I drove up there in January, found a room in a house I shared with 3 other guys for $350 a month, and started working nights at a distribution center off the Gene Snyder Freeway. The work was physical and exhausting and mind-numbing, and I loved it, strangely, because when you're moving boxes from a conveyor to a pallet for 8 hours straight, your mind goes quiet. And I needed quiet. I was 21 years old, and both my parents were dead, and the grief sat on me like something with weight, like a coat I couldn't take off. Moving boxes gave me something to do with my hands, while the grief did whatever grief does in the dark. I did that for 2 years. I got a second job at a UPS hub, working mornings, so I was doing doubles most weeks, sleeping 5 hours when I could, eating whatever was cheap and fast. I paid off the small debts my parents had left. I saved money. Not a lot, but some. And I started reading. I've never talked about this publicly, but those 2 years of doubles, that's when I started reading about business. I'd find books at the library, thrift stores, library sales. Rich Dad, Poor Dad, The E-Myth, Good to Great. Then I started finding niche stuff, operations management, supply chain logistics, inventory systems. I read books that were honestly too advanced for where I was, books written for people with MBAs and corner offices. But I read them anyway, and about 40% of it stuck, and that 40% turned out to be enough. Because here's what I was seeing every single day at work that nobody else seemed to be paying attention to: waste. Enormous, staggering, almost offensive amounts of operational waste. I watched products get mis-sorted and rerouted and delayed, not because the systems were bad, but because the communication between shift supervisors was terrible. I watched inventory sit in the wrong zones for days because nobody had built a simple tracking sheet. I watched managers make decisions in the morning based on numbers that were 12 hours old. And I kept thinking, someone could fix this. Someone could come in here and build something better and make a lot of money doing it. I started writing things down. Just observations at first, in a spiral notebook I kept in my locker. Then systems. Proposals, basically, though I didn't call them that at the time. I wrote up a process improvement suggestion for my shift supervisor, a stocky guy named Walt Briggs who wore the same green fleece every day and genuinely cared about his team. I handed it to him on a Tuesday. He read it, looked up at me, and said, "Who else has seen this?" I said, "Nobody." He said, "Keep it that way until I talk to my boss." 3 weeks later, Walt's boss's boss called me into an office and asked me to explain my proposal in person. I did. They implemented about 60% of what I'd suggested over the next 4 months. I didn't get credit. I didn't get a raise. But something else happened, something more valuable. I understood for the first time that I had a talent, that I could see problems other people couldn't, that my brain worked in a particular way around systems and flow and inefficiency, and that way was worth something. I just had to figure out how to make it worth something for myself instead of for somebody else. It took me until 2016 to make my first real move. By then, I'd saved about $22,000. That sounds like a lot until you try to start business with it. I'd been promoted twice at the distribution center and was now a shift lead, making $18 an hour, which felt like riches compared to where I'd started. I'd also spent the last year picking up freelance work on the side, helping small businesses in Louisville audit their inventory and fulfillment processes, doing it nights and weekends for $500 a project, sometimes less. I had 7 clients. I was exhausted. I was also more alive than I'd ever been. My first legitimate business was called Streamline Ops. Not the most creative name, I'll admit, but it said what it was. I offered operational consulting to small and mid-sized retail and e-commerce businesses, specifically in the gap between when a company gets big enough to need real logistics infrastructure and when they're big enough to afford an enterprise solution. That gap is enormous, and in 2016, it was growing fast. Every mom-and-pop brand that had gone viral on Instagram or blown up on Etsy was suddenly shipping thousands of units a month with systems built for hundreds, and they were drowning. I quit my distribution center job on a Friday. I cried in my car on the way home. Not sad tears, terrified tears, which is something different. The kind where your body is trying to warn you and congratulate you at the same time. The first year, I made $38,000 in revenue. After expenses and taxes, I took home maybe 19, which was less than I'd been making at the warehouse. I moved into a smaller apartment. I ate a lot of peanut butter. I worked 16-hour days with the kind of focused desperation that I think you can only sustain when you have nothing to fall back on. If you have a safety net, some part of your brain knows it's there, and that part of your brain will use that knowledge against you in your weakest moments. I didn't have a safety net. I had a spiral notebook and $20,000 that was going down fast. It was in that year that I called my Uncle Russ. I'm not proud of this, but I want to be honest because this story is about honesty. I called him because I was scared and lonely, and he was the closest thing I had to a parent, even though he'd never once made me feel like family. I called him on a Sunday evening and told him I'd started a consulting business, and I was struggling, but I believed in it, and I was wondering if he knew any business owners who might need my services. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dan, I say this with love. You're not a businessman. You're a warehouse worker who read some books. There's no shame in going back to what you're good at." I said, "Okay, Russ." I hung up. I didn't call him again for 4 years. Here's what nobody tells you about building something real. The first breakthrough doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like Tuesday. Mine came in the spring of 2017, when a woman named Joelle Navarro found me through a Louisville small business Facebook group and asked if I could help her company. Joelle ran a skincare brand out of a warehouse in Jeffersontown. About 40 employees, beautiful products, a cult following online. She was also, by her own admission, hemorrhaging money through operational inefficiencies at a rate that was going to kill her company within 18 months if nothing changed. I spent 3 days doing an audit. I found 11 distinct problems, ranging from mislabeled SKUs to a receiving process that was adding 2 extra days to every supplier delivery. I wrote a 50-page report. Joelle read the whole thing, looked up at me across her conference table, and said, "How long to fix all of this?" I said, 6 months if you're serious." She said, "I'm serious. What do you charge?" I named a number that felt audacious. $5,000 a month, plus a percentage of verified savings. She didn't even blink. Deal. That was the moment. Not the money, though the money helped more than I can explain. It was the not blinking. It was someone looking at what I'd built and saying, "Yes, that's worth it." It was being taken seriously for the first time in my professional life by someone who had no reason to doubt me and every reason to trust her own judgment. I worked with Joelle for 14 months. By the end, her operational costs were down 23%. She wrote me a testimonial that I still have saved on my phone. Within 6 months of starting with Joelle, I had 4 more clients at similar or higher rates. I hired my first contractor, a sharp young guy named Marcus Webb who'd been doing supply chain work for a big retailer and was ready to do something smaller and more meaningful. By the end of 2018, Streamline Ops had 4 full-time employees, including me, revenue of just over $400,000, and a reputation in Louisville's small business community that had started to extend outward into Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Nashville. Nashville, my family's city. I thought about that sometimes at night, driving home. I thought about my Uncle Russ telling me I was a warehouse worker who'd read some books. I thought about Derek and his sandwich. I thought about 47 people laughing at a party that hadn't happened yet, but would. I thought about it, and then I put away because the best revenge isn't anger. The best revenge is so much quieter than that. By 2020, I had a decision to make. Streamline Ops had grown into something I hadn't fully planned for. We had 12 employees. We had clients across 8 states. We'd started doing work not just with small businesses, but with mid-market companies, the $50 million to $200 million range. And that work was more complex, higher stakes, and much better paid. Our revenue in 2019 had been just under $3 million. In 2020, even with the pandemic chaos, it hit $4.2 million. But I'd also been approached twice by private equity firms interested in acquiring us or taking a significant stake. And I'd started having conversations with a strategic buyer, a larger operations consulting firm based in Chicago called Meridian Group, who wanted to expand their footprint in the Southeast and saw Streamline as the perfect vehicle. I kept these conversations quiet. My employees knew the business was doing well. My attorney knew about the acquisition talks. My accountant knew. Marcus knew because Marcus was now my partner, holding 15% of the company, and he deserved to know. My family knew nothing. That was deliberate. I want to be clear about that. I didn't tell my family about my success not because I was ashamed, but because I learned something important about people who underestimate you. You should let them. Not forever, but for a while. Because the moment you show your hand, they change the terms. They start treating you differently. Not because they respect you, but because they want something from you. And I wanted to know, when the moment finally came, exactly who each of those people was. So I kept quiet. I went to Brittany's engagement party in 2021 with my cracked windshield and my Goodwill blazer, and I stood there while my uncle called me a cautionary tale, and I smiled, and I said nothing. I ate the shrimp cocktail. I drove 4 hours back to Louisville, and I called Marcus from the highway and told him we were going to close the Meridian deal. We closed it in March of 2022. The final number, after 18 months of negotiation and due diligence and moments where I honestly thought it was going to fall apart. The final number was $14.6 million. Marcus made $2.1 million on his 15%. I made the rest. I was 33 years old. I sat in my attorney's office in downtown Louisville, signed my name on the papers, and then went home and sat in my kitchen for a long time, very still, not celebrating, just feeling the weight of something that had been heavy for a very long time finally lift. I thought about the foil on the window on Hartsville Pike. I thought about my mom laughing about the pie. I thought about the warehouse and the spiral notebook and the peanut butter years and Walt Briggs and his green fleece and Joel Navarro not blinking. And then, for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry. The real kind. The kind that's been building for 12 years and finally runs out of reasons to wait. That December, my cousin Brittany's husband, whose name was Todd, had a thing about Christmas. He loved it the way some people love a religion. He decorated their house in Franklin, Tennessee, starting the day after Thanksgiving, and every year he and Brittany hosted a family Christmas party that the whole Holloway side was expected to attend. White lights everywhere. A 12-foot tree. Eggnog and bourbon and a cheese board so elaborate it looked like architecture. I hadn't been to one of these in 4 years. I'd missed Brittany's 2019 party because of a client crisis. I'd missed 2020 and 2021 for the obvious reasons. But Brittany had called me personally in October 2022 and asked me to come. And there was something in her voice, something sincere, I thought, something that remembered we'd grown up building blanket forts together. And I said yes. I almost didn't go. I sat in my Nashville hotel room the morning of the party and thought about every reason not to walk into that house. I thought about the engagement party. I thought about my uncle's voice carrying across that marble floor. I thought about Derek and the sandwich. I thought about all the phone calls that hadn't happened and the check-ins nobody had done and the years I'd spent building something in a city 4 hours away, while my family lived 20 miles from where I'd grown up and never once wondered if I was okay. But I also thought about something my mom used to say. She'd say, "Danny, you can't heal what you won't face." And she was right. She was usually right. So I put on a coat, a good one, charcoal wool, the kind my uncle would notice, and I drove to Franklin. The house looked the way Todd's Christmas always looked. Warm light in every window. Cars lining the street for half a block. When I walked in, I could smell the tree and the cider and something good in the oven, and for just a second, standing in the doorway, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt like I was home, or like I was in a place that could have been home if things had gone differently. Brittany found me in about 30 seconds. She was wearing a green dress, her dark hair up, and she hugged me harder than I expected and said, "I'm so glad you came." I mean that. I believed her. The first hour was actually fine. I talked to Aunt Patricia, my mom's youngest sister, who always had a warmth to her that the rest of the family seemed to have been born without. She asked about Louisville, about my work, and I was deliberately vague. Consulting, I said some operational work. She nodded and said she'd heard I was doing well, and she was proud of me. That meant something. I didn't take it lightly. My Uncle Gerald cornered me by the cheese board, and asked if I was still doing the logistics thing. I said yes. He nodded with the expression of a man who's interested but not interested, the way people look when they ask about something they assume doesn't matter. He told me about his latest project, a real estate development in Nolansville, for about 8 minutes without once asking a follow-up question about me. Then his wife called him over and he left. Russ hadn't arrived yet when I walked in. I noticed that. I noticed the absence the way you notice a weather system that hasn't reached you yet. He showed up about 45 minutes into the party, with Connie on his arm and Derek behind him. He looked the same. Bigger, maybe. More comfortable. The way men who've never been uncomfortable look when they age. He saw me across the room, and his expression did something complicated. Something between surprise and amusement. And he crossed the room with his hand already out and said, "Well, I'll be damned." "Daniel." I shook his hand. "Russell." He did the thing where he grips your hand and puts his other hand over it. A power move. The kind of handshake that says, "I'm in charge here," even if the words say, "I'm glad to see you." "How long's it been?" he asked. "Brittany's engagement party," I said. 2021. Something flickered in his face. He didn't remember what he'd said. I could tell. Or if he did, it had meant so little to him that it had filed itself away as unimportant. And that, right there, that not remembering, that was its own kind of thing to carry. Right, he said. "You still up in Louisville?" I said. "I moved back to Nashville earlier this year." He raised his eyebrows, and I watched him calculate something. A warehouse worker who'd moved back to his hometown. "Doing what?" he asked. "Sold my company," I said, taking some time to figure out the next thing. He nodded slowly, and I watched him hear the word company and let it pass without sticking, the way water runs off a surface that's been waxed too many times. Good, he said. "Well, good for you." "Connie, look who's here." Gary and Linda's boy. Connie turned and smiled and said something gracious and hollow, and Derek looked up from his phone long enough to nod, and then the three of them drifted away toward the bar, and I stood there alone for a moment and took a breath. Okay, I thought. Okay. It happened at dinner. Todd had set up long tables in the dining room and the adjacent sitting room, the kind of setup where everyone's crowded, but it feels festive. I was at a table with Brittany and Todd, Aunt Patricia, a couple of cousins I barely knew, and through some cosmic joke or deliberate design, I still don't know which, my Uncle Russ. The food was incredible. Todd was an excellent cook and clearly poured himself into this meal every year. We were about halfway through the main course when the conversation turned to money, the way family conversations always turn to money when there's wine involved. Russ was talking about his tire shops, which he'd expanded since his father's time from 12 locations to 22. He was holding court the way he always did, leaning back in his chair, gesturing with his fork, saying things like smart money and leverage and cash flow, the vocabulary of a man who's learned that confidence sounds like expertise. Then Gerald, who was at the adjacent table but loud enough to be part of the conversation, said something about a friend of his who'd just sold a software company. "Made $11 million, Gerald said, with the reverence people reserve for numbers that feel too big to be real. "Can you imagine?" And Russ laughed. "That's the dream, right? Some of us are still in the real world, building brick-and-mortar businesses, not these things that appear out of nowhere and disappear the same way." He said it looking at me. Not a long look, just a glance, just enough to include me in the category of people not building real things. And then he looked away. I put down my fork. I don't know what made at the moment. It wasn't that it was the worst thing he'd ever said. It wasn't even close to the worst thing he'd ever said. But there's a thing that happens when you've been carrying something for a long time. The weight doesn't build gradually, it builds in plateaus, and then one small thing tips you from one plateau to the next, and all of a sudden the whole weight shifts. The room was loud. Conversations overlapping. Todd was refilling glasses. Brittany was laughing at something across the table. I said, calmly, "Russell." He turned. "I sold my company," I said. "In March." He blinked. "Right, you mentioned that." "I don't think I mentioned the number," I said. Pause. "The number?" "The sale price." I picked up my wine glass. Set it down. 14.6 million. The corner of the table went quiet first. Brittany looked up. Russ stared at me. I kept my voice level. I'd imagined this moment about 100 times in 100 different versions. Angry, theatrical, confrontational. But sitting there, I didn't feel any of those things. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes from being completely sure of the ground beneath you. 14.6, Russ repeated, like he was testing the words. After 8 years, I said. Louisville, operational consulting. Started with $22,000 and a notebook. Grew it to 12 employees, $4.2 million in annual revenue, and sold it to a Chicago firm called Meridian Group in March of this year. The quiet was spreading now. Gerald had turned around in his chair. Patricia had gone very still. I moved back to Nashville in July, I said. Bought a house in Green Hills. Cash. Russ opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. And then he said, and I want to get this exactly right because I've replayed it so many times. He said, Danny, why didn't you tell us? Not congratulations. Not I'm proud of you. Not I'm sorry for what I said at Brittany's party. Not I'm sorry for the handshake or the guest house comment or the phone call in 2016 when he told me I was just a warehouse worker who'd read some books. Why didn't you tell us? As if the problem was mine. As if the failure of communication was the story here. I looked at him for a long moment. You didn't ask, I said. What happened in the next 15 minutes is something I've tried to describe to people and have never fully managed to capture. The table shifted. Gerald came over. Connie appeared at Russ's shoulder. Derek put down his phone. Faces turned toward me the way flowers turn toward light. Except it wasn't light they were turning toward. It was money. They could sense it. They could smell it the way certain animals smell rain before it comes. The questions started slowly and then fast. What are you going to do next? Are you investing in anything? Did you get good tax advice on the exit? We should get together, have lunch. There's actually a property deal I've been wanting to talk through. I sat very still through all of it, watching, noticing. Brittany was the only one who stood apart. She sat across the table from me, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, part apology, part wonder, part something that might have been grief. She'd grown up with me. She'd seen the foil on the window. And I think, in that moment, she was the only one in the room who understood what she was actually watching. After about 5 minutes of the questions and the noise and the shifting faces, I set down my fork again, and I spoke loudly enough to be heard by everyone at both tables. I want to say something, I said, and I want everyone to hear it, because I'm only going to say it once. The room got quiet. Russ was watching me with an expression that wasn't quite confident anymore. I have loved this family my whole life, I said, and I have spent my whole life watching this family decide that I was the lesser version of it. I was Gary and Linda's kid. I was the one who grew up without the right address. I was the cautionary tale. I watched Russ' face when I said that. He flinched just slightly, so he did remember. I drove 4 hours to Brittany's engagement party in a car with a cracked windshield because I wanted to belong here. I walked into this house, and I heard what was said, and I smiled, and I left, and I drove 4 hours back, and I went to work. Patricia had tears on her face. I didn't build my company to prove something to this room, I said. I want to be clear about that. I built it because it was inside me and it needed to come out. But I'd be lying if I said none of this was in the back of my mind. The warehouse worker who read books. The charity case. The cautionary tale. Those words. They live somewhere in you when someone you love puts them there. I carried them for a long time. Derek was looking at the tablecloth. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it, and that was the most surprising thing. I actually meant it. I'm not here to make anyone feel bad tonight. Brittany, Todd. This is a beautiful party, and I'm grateful to be here. I'm just done pretending. I'm done walking into rooms and making myself smaller, so nobody in this family has to feel uncomfortable about the distance between where you thought I was and where I actually was. The silence was extraordinary, the kind that has texture. Then my Uncle Russ said quietly, Daniel, I owe you an apology. And I looked at him, at this big, confident man who defined so much of my childhood understanding of worth and failure, and I felt something that surprised me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, exactly. Something closer to sorrow. Because here was the thing about that moment. I didn't want his apology the way I used to want it. I didn't need it the way I once would have needed it. The version of me that would have broken down hearing those words, the version that would have hugged him and said it's okay, it's fine, we're good, that version had been replaced slowly, year by year, by someone who understood that an apology spoken only after success isn't the same thing as an apology spoken out of love. I know you do, I said. I appreciate you saying so. And I picked up my fork. After dinner, I stepped outside onto Todd's back deck. It was cold, mid-December cold, the kind that feels like it means it. I could see my breath. The backyard was still decorated with white lights strung through the bare trees. And from inside, I could hear the sounds of the party reassembling itself into something approaching normal. Brittany came out about 5 minutes later. She was holding 2 cups of cider. She handed me one. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the engagement party. For all of it. You didn't say anything wrong at the engagement party. I didn't say anything right, either." She looked out at the lights. I should have said something. I knew it was wrong when he said it. It's always been easier to let Russ be Russ. I nodded. I understood that. Easier to let the loudest voice go unchallenged, because challenging it costs something, and sometimes the cost feels too high when it's not your battle. "He's going to try to make this about him," she said quietly. "He's already in there telling Gerald he always knew you had it in you." I laughed. Actually laughed, a real one. "Of course he is. Will you come back? To things like this? Are we?" She paused. "Are we okay?" I thought about it. Genuinely considered the question, which she deserved. "You and me?" I said. "Yeah, we're okay. We've always been okay, Britt. You were never the problem." I looked at her. "But I'm not going to pretend things are fine with Russ, just because now he knows the number. If things are going to be different, they have to be actually different. Not because of the money, because of what the money represents, which is that I was always somebody, even when he decided I wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "That's fair," she said. "That's really fair." We stood there for a while, in the cold, with our cider, 2 cousins on a December deck, figuring out what to do with a family that had always been too complicated to love simply. What followed the Christmas party was predictable, if I'm being honest. In the days after, I received texts from 3 separate family members I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins who'd ignored my existence through my entire Louisville decade suddenly wanted to reconnect. Gerald called me on a Wednesday morning. I let it go to voicemail and left a message about a real estate opportunity in Nolensville he thought I might be interested in, given my background in business. My background in business. As if it were a formal credential he'd always respected. Derek actually sent me a direct message on Instagram. He was thinking about starting a company and wanted to pick my brain sometime. He'd never once in his life expressed interest in entrepreneurship. He had, however, expressed interest in the fact that I'd made $14.6 million doing something I'd started with my own 2 hands while he was eating a sandwich and telling me not to touch his weights. I didn't respond to most of it. Not out of cruelty, genuinely not out of cruelty. But there's a clarity that comes with arriving somewhere after a long road, and part of that clarity is being honest about what you're willing to carry forward. I was willing to carry Brittany forward. I was willing to carry Patricia forward. I was willing to give Russ the space to be genuinely different if he chose to use it. But I wasn't willing to become a resource. I wasn't willing to become the family ATM or the family connection or the family proof that Holloways could succeed when they tried hard enough. I was just Daniel. And the only people getting access to Daniel were the ones who'd wanted Daniel when Daniel was driving a cracked windshield and eating peanut butter and building something invisible. I had lunch with my Uncle Russ in January. He asked for it, and I agreed because I wanted to give him the chance to be real with me. We sat in a restaurant in Brentwood, and for the first 20 minutes, he talked around it, talked about his business, about real estate in the county, about how the tire and auto industry was changing. And I let him. And then the food came, and he got quiet, and he looked at his plate, and he said, "I was hard on you." "Yes," I said. "I think," he stopped. "Tried again. I think I looked at Gary and Linda, and I saw your dad as a man who hadn't done what I'd done, and I put that on you. That wasn't right." I looked at my uncle, this man who had loomed so large in my childhood, in my sense of what I was and wasn't. And I saw something I hadn't expected to see. An old man who was genuinely reckoning with something. Not performing it, actually reckoning. My dad, I said, was the best person I've ever known. He worked himself to the bone for 20 years to take care of his family. And he did it without complaining, and he died doing it. You want to know what kind of man he was? He used to leave $5 bills under my pillow when I was little, even when we barely had it. Said it was from the work fairy. Told me the work fairy only visited kids who worked hard and were kind. I was 20 years old when he died, and I still thought about that. I paused. You had money. He had character. I know which one I'd rather inherit. Russ didn't say anything for a long time. I could see something moving behind his eyes, some old arithmetic being reworked. I'm sorry, he said finally. And then, I'm sorry about the engagement party. I don't know why I said that. I do, I said. You said it because you decided who I was and you needed me to keep being it. It's easier to keep someone in a box than to admit the box was wrong. He nodded slowly. I forgive you, I said. Not because what you did was okay, but because I'm not interested in carrying it anymore. The weight is yours now. What you do with it is your choice. We finished lunch. We shook hands at the door. A different handshake this time. One hand. Equal pressure. He looked older on the way out than he had on the way in. And I don't mean that as a cruelty. I mean that truth ages people the way it's supposed to. It makes them honest, finally, about how much time has already passed. I'm 34 years old now. I live in Green Hills, Nashville, in a house I paid for with money I made from something I built with my own hands and the 40% of badly written business books that stuck. I spend most of my time thinking about what to build next. I got a few ideas. I always have a few ideas. There's a problem in the healthcare supply chain space I've been watching for a couple of years, and I think there's a solution that nobody's built right yet. Marcus and I have been talking. He's restless too. Good partners always are. I go to Brittany and Todd's Christmas party now, every year. I like Todd. He makes an extraordinary cheese board. I sit with Brittany and Patricia, and we talk the way people talk when they're actually glad to see each other. Russ is there too, and we talk civilly, genuinely sometimes, carefully always. It's not the same as it would be if we'd gotten here by a different road. But it's something. It's more than I thought we'd have. Derek reached out again in the spring. He had an idea for an app. Something about fitness tracking, I think. He wanted to know if I'd invest. I told him I'd look at a business plan if he wrote one. He hasn't sent one yet. I don't expect he will. Some people want the outcome without the spiral notebook and the peanut butter years, and I have too much respect for the process to pretend that's okay. I think about my mom a lot, still, more than I used to, which surprised me. I thought success would quiet her voice, but instead it's amplified it. I hear her in the mornings. I hear her saying, "You can't heal what you won't face." I hear her saying the pie. "Danny, they got to the pie before I did." And I hear her laughing about it, the way she always did, the way she chose to hold it. I think about what I'd tell her if I could. I think I'd tell her that the pie thing was the wrong way to see it. Not because it wasn't true. It was true. They did get there first, and they did eat most of it. But because what she gave me, what she and my dad gave me, the foil on the window and the work fairy and the warehouse and the $22,000 in the spiral notebook, what they gave me was the ability to bake my own. And you know what? It turned out to be enough. More than enough. Here's what I know now, at 34, with a paid-off house and a new idea beginning to form in the back of my mind the way all good ideas do, quietly at first, like smoke before the fire. The people who underestimate you are not your enemies. They are, in a strange and painful way, part of your fuel. Every time someone looked at me and saw Gary and Linda's kid, every time someone said cautionary tale or read some books, or when are you going back to the warehouse, they were adding something to fire they didn't know they were feeding. And I don't say that to give them credit. They don't get the credit. I get the credit. But I don't want to pretend the friction didn't shape the thing either. The loneliness of those Louisville years, the doubles, the peanut butter, the 600-square-foot apartment, that loneliness wasn't punishment. It was tuition, and it was worth every dollar. The thing I'd most want someone to take from this story, the thing I want you to hold on to if you're in your own Louisville right now, if you're in your own cracked windshield moment, if there is someone in your life who has decided who you are without asking you, is this. You don't need their permission to become yourself. You don't need their apology before you start. You don't need their belief before you build. You don't need to be recognized by the people who underestimated you before you're allowed to feel like your work was real. It was always real. The spiral notebook was real. The $22,000 was real. Joel not blinking was real. Walt Briggs and his green fleece was real. Marcus was real. The $14.6 million was real. All of it was real, every step of it, whether my family knew it was happening or not. The only moment their opinion ever mattered was the moment I finally stopped needing it. In that moment, that quiet, ordinary, extraordinary moment, happened somewhere on the Gene Snyder Freeway in 2016, driving home from a warehouse on a Tuesday night with a notebook in my passenger seat for $1,000 in savings and a future that was entirely mine to build. That was the moment everything changed. Not December in Brentwood, with the white lights and the silence and the number. That was just the moment everyone else found out. My name is Daniel Cruz, and this is my story.